I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to welcome New York City on WBAI and Washington, D.C. on WPFW, and wherever else you may be listening, because we do put this show up as a podcast, and we, of course, post a video on Facebook and on YouTube as well. So you may see this any number of ways or hear this any number of ways. And of course, you can also listen online from WBAI's website or WPFW's website. Well, sometimes you just go to the TuneIn app and you can say play either one of those stations while I'm on the air, and you'll catch the program. So I want to thank you for listening. I also want to thank those of you who support these stations to not only keep me on the air, but to keep the entire stations on the air. It is what is required. We live in a time where there is an increasing amount of pressure to silence dissent. And frankly, this show is called Resistance Radio. So dissent is what we're kind of all about. So don't allow them to silence us. Don't allow them to silence these stations. And your main means of doing so is to support these stations by making a donation to WBAI or WPFW. That is how we stay on the air. That is how I stay on the air. So please do support these radio stations. Know that we are committed as producers and as radio stations to giving you essentially an unending stream of information on a variety of topics. Obviously, we have diverse programming on the stations, and I try to offer a perspective you're not going to hear from any other native broadcaster or podcaster or whatever you may have. I know that I'm offering a narrative that kind of breaks the narrative that you've been fed, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit today because we are coming out of we're in the midst of, I should say, a period of time where there are these special days and special commemorations, but oftentimes the message gets lost in it. Last Tuesday was what is regarded as Orange Shirt Day. It began in Canada and has been adopted across Native territories and communities that have Native populations. It was also considered the Canada's National Day of for Truth and Reconciliation. But it's kind of colloquially known as Orange Shirt Day, and part of it is because there's a story associated with a child who was sent to a residential school, unbeknownst to the parent what the school was really going to be, and she was sent with a brand new orange shirt to kind of celebrate her first day of school. We take this stuff for granted because we all dress up our kids, right? We send them off to school. Well, that's not a new custom, but it wasn't a custom that it was accepted at a quote unquote Indian boarding school or residential school. She had the shirt taken from her and burned, and so that was her new outfit for the day. Instead, she was stripped, and all of her identity would also be stripped ultimately, and her hair would be cut. She would be put into clothing that would conform with all the other kids. And that's kind of where the story or the source of this notion of an orange shirt day comes from. Now we get all these shirts printed and they say every child matters, or they have, some beautiful designs on them. I'm not crazy about the slogan, as you probably well know, because you've probably heard me talk about. To me, every child matters is kind of like what white folks did to Black Lives Matter. They said, their answer back was, all lives matter. Well, if every child mattered, would we even be having this day? Would we even be discussing this? And would Native children, have been ripped away from their homes and families and sent to these schools? Clearly, our children didn't matter. So, to me, the statement should be, our children matter. Native children matter. But, again, I don't want to condemn those who participated in buying or creating an orange shirt for the day. But I want to add some perspective to it. So Tuesday was Orange Shirt Day. Coming up in a week or so is a day that has Columbus Day, increasingly being replaced by Indigenous Peoples Day. So that's coming up on October 13th. And of course, in November, the various presidential administrations over the years, I don't know if this one will do it, frankly, I don't know what this one is up to, but Historically, fairly recent history anyway, the presidents of the United States have declared November as National Native American Heritage Month. So November is supposed to be our month. October 13th is our day. September 30th was a day. But I have to warn people, these are not days of celebration. And because I don't think we have much to celebrate. And today I'm going to talk with the main emphasis on residential schools. I know I've talked about it in the past, but I feel like we've got to break some of the narrative that's out there. We got to break the propaganda. Look, these special days, these special commemorations, special month, these are PR stunts, and they are backed primarily by the governments, Canada and the United States. They also end up with corporate backing because you could buy your orange shirt at Walmart or Costco or any place else. I mean, you could buy your orange blanks at Hobby Lobby, and we know how they feel about diversity. And make your own orange shirt. Essentially, you're not really making it; you're just printing it differently. So, I mean, what happens is we take a sentiment, and then as we attempt to popularize it, it gets co-opted. And I'm not saying every message associated with Orange Shirt Day was co-opted, but many were. And I got to tell you, I have a quote that is in our film, The Long Hope, in which I say, "Kill the Indian, save the man" was not just a metaphor. Metaphors don't require graveyards. And for those of you who have no idea what I was just talking about, the slogan that was developed out of the United States flagship boarding school, which was the Carlisle Indian School, or the Carlisle School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, their slogan and their strategy was essentially kill the Indian, save the man. I mean, and look, that line was massaged a few times. It said kill the Indian within the child, or kill the Indian to save the man. I mean, but at the end of the day, it was kill the Indian, save the man. Now, these weren't men. These were little boys and little girls. And the reason I say that it wasn't just a metaphor is because children died. I mean, if you were really just trying to kill an identity or kill a sense or a spirit, then for one thing, would you even use the word kill in the first place? And that's why I must insist that regardless of what you've been told, regardless of what you've been taught, this was not simply assimilation. And let me explain. Dead kids are not assimilation. Raped children are not some sort of Christian conversion therapy. Sterilization of young girls is not Americanization of Native kids. So when I hear people say, well, kill the Indian, save the man, it really just meant that they were going to, try to assimilate us, and they were going to try to, take away our native identities so we would conform to Americanization or Canadian society, American society, and that we would be absorbed. No, that's not what it was. It was about destroying us. It was about exterminating us. And look, you don't have dead kids if you're trying to assimilate. There's no reason to rape children or bury the babies that were born out of these schools, because that wasn't supposed to happen. Yeah, we could talk about wiping out language and removing all semblance of identity, from objects to clothing to names. Yeah, we could talk about that. But even that is erasure. It's not just about erasing the names. It's not just about erasing the identity. It's about erasing us as a people. And look, tens of thousands of kids died in these schools. Some died because they were killed. Some died of neglect. Some died trying to escape them. Some died of malnutrition. Some died from improper health care. The mortality rate at some of these schools was in excess of 50%. That means half the children that went into these schools died. These schools had graveyards. There's never a reason for a school for children to have graveyards. And keep in mind, these weren't babies that are the most vulnerable to disease. These are the healthiest years of a human being's life. In fact, Carlisle Indian School was really designed for kids in their teens. And yet they had a graveyard. And not only did they have a graveyard where they put actual grave markers and gravestones, some of those gravestones said unknown. Well, how in the hell do you have a school, the flagship school of the United States for this strategy, for this purpose, that doesn't know the name of a child? Well, I mean, one of the simple answers is because they wiped out our names. Any name that had any connection to native language was removed, eliminated. And then they were replaced with biblical names like John, Joshua, Abraham, or Sarah, Mary, or Maria. This is what happened. Our names were wiped out. We were forbidden to speak the language. And it wasn't like we were being taught English as a second language. No, our language was being eliminated. We lost any ability to have contact with our families when we were in these schools. While we were in these schools, we experienced the largest period of land loss. So let me clarify. We're talking about 150 years. 150 years. So while these schools were ripping our kids away from parents and communities and their nations, we experienced the largest period of land loss during that period of time. We obviously experienced the largest period of identity loss, autonomy loss. They justified this by characterizing our people as wards of the federal government. So we were being regarded as incompetent people or barely people. We were considered too incompetent to raise our own children, so the government had to do it for us. And the government appointed themselves. We never entered into any trust agreement with the United States. We didn't sign any documents. We didn't sign our kids away. We didn't grant power of attorney to the federal government. No, they just took it all. They took our children. And as the populations were decreased because of the absence of children and because of what the remaining communities would experience, they took land. They said, "Oh, you don't have the population to support having this much land, so we're going to pay you off. We're going to allot the land. We're going to give you a small parcel there, and whatever excess is, we're going to sell it off or grant it off to land grant colleges and the like, churches, whatever. We're gonna dispose of the rest of the land for you." So we lose our lands, we lose our children, we lose the intergenerational connection between grandparent, mother, and daughter, between aunts and daughters, between uncles and nephews, fathers and sons. All that's wiped out for 150 years. So the narrative that killed the Indian, saved the man, we just mean assimilation. No, you didn't. And abuse took place at every one of these schools. It's not like it was this one-off, or that, because of the lack of oversight, some of these schools might have experienced a little bit of, bad behavior. No, they all abuse children. So whether it was written into their mandate or not, the unspoken mandate was to make those children's lives miserable. And among the things that they did to those children was to convince them that you are evil little creatures. You are evil. Your culture, your community, your family, they've been teaching you satanic worship. And we're going to purge that from you, even if it kills you. That's what happened at these schools. They were taught that who they were was evil and satanic. And it was only through the grace of their God that these children could be even somewhat redeemed. And I say redeemed because, frankly, New York State referred to the children as irredeemable children. They said Native kids, they're irredeemable. We can't save them. So let's do something that can at least plug them into the bottom rungs of our society as unskilled laborers, or maybe we'll get them to carry a gun and serve as a soldier or a housemaid. We're not going to educate these kids. These kids aren't going to have careers. They're irredeemable. They don't represent any significant part of our society. That's what New York State said. That was the New York State view. That was the state view. But it was also the federal government's view. We weren't being conditioned to become good Americans. When we talk about whether these bad schools were the anomaly, no, the anomaly were the few individual children who could honestly say that their boarding school experience was a positive one, or that they learned it, they were, got an education. Look, some kids learn how to play the piano for their church plays. And all these kids were fully inundated with large dosages of Christian propaganda. They were forced, physically forced, not just psychologically and emotionally, but physically forced to become Christians. That's what they did to our kids for 150 years. So if you survived the school, and I don't mean just live through it to survive. I mean, if you survived the whole experience without being raped or psychologically damaged or somehow traumatized in such a way that you would create intergenerational trauma, because that's what they call it. Look, little girls were sterilized. Young girls, they performed surgeries on them so they would not bear children, especially what they considered the full-bloods. They figured, well, this girl's kind of pale. She's probably half-breed. They're well on their way to, to having been ethnically cleansed. But the full-bloods, who they regarded as the full-bloods, those were the primary candidates for this. And there's no other way to describe it other than eugenics. Look, if you're going to take away the ability for an entire group of people to repopulate, you're going to, not only are our children going to die, not only is there going to be death, and keep in mind, this 150 years, there were still massacres taking place during this. The last massacre, the Wounded Knee Massacre, was 1890. So, I mean, that's when these residential schools were in full swing. In fact, some people sent their kids to these residential schools to avoid them being massacred, to avoid them being the victims of violence and abject poverty, not knowing what they were really subjecting their kids to, and having no means. Look, you couldn't pick up the telephone. Even though these schools existed into the 1970s in the United States and into the 1990s on the Canadian side. This is what this was. It was an attempt to destroy us. Look, I talk about these residential schools being the textbook definition of genocide, because genocide involves causing death with the intent to destroy a people. It includes physically harming a people to destroy them, to destroy their identity and who they are, to destroy their national character. And that physical abuse could be beatings, malnutrition, rape, other sexual assaults. The third, again, these are the definitions of genocide. The third definition is creating the conditions that are set to intentionally destroy a people. Well, that's where you could talk about culture, but it's not just culture. You are stripping every sense of identity. We are completely identified only by culture. We are I mean, the courts even acknowledge that we are not a race of Americans. We are distinct political entities. That's what Native people, that's what the courts, even the U.S. courts, acknowledge. That our distinction is one of political distinction, not racial or ethnic distinction. So creating the conditions that would destroy us was to eliminate even that political distinction. Pledge allegiance to the flag. Cast away any sense of your native identity. That's not just culture. And especially when it's tied to physical abuse. The fourth is sterilization. Anything that you do that would interfere with the reproductive rights and abilities of a people. That's the fourth overt act that constitutes genocide. And the fifth is literally taking our children, which is what the schools were all about. Taking our children. Taking our children from one group, from the group that they represent, and placing them in the custody, care, or control of another group. That's how genocide is defined. And that was almost the playbook of residential schools. So don't tell me residential schools represented cultural genocide. No, they represented genocide, the full, broadest possible definition of genocide, or the narrowest definition of genocide. That's what these schools represented. It wasn't just an attempt to make us fit in, to make us conform, to indoctrinate us, to assimilate. No. It was to reduce our population. I mean, what possible reason could sterilizing young women, young girls, do in the assimilation process? Of course that's absurd to even suggest that. And I've got Native people saying this to me. Say, well, it was really geared towards trying to make us absorb into the into American and Canadian societies. No. I'm not saying that wasn't a part of it. And we could argue the vast majority of children would face that identity crisis that survived the schools. But I got to tell you, sterilization wasn't the only way to interrupt with childbearing. Rapes, the psychological damage that went into both boys and girls, because little boys were raped too. How do you think they were going to represent themselves as would-be fathers? Women, young girls who were raped. How many girls refused to have children or could not have children because of the psychological damage? Forget about the surgeries. No, don't forget about them. But set aside the surgeries, there was physical trauma done to children, boys and girls, that alone would interfere with the ability for these children ever to be parents. And not only to bear children, but to be parents. To know how to raise a child, to know how to love a child. They didn't get treated with any of that in the school. It was denied from their parents. Look, we have got to push back on this narrative. We cannot allow them to whitewash this thing. And truth and reconciliation, there was no truth and reconciliation on the Canadian side. For one thing, there was no truth. To this day, there's been no admission of what they did. They apologized. They had the gall to ask us for our forgiveness. Justin Trudeau, Joe Biden, Kathy Hochul, the Pope. You've got the gall to ask us for your forgiveness? When you won't even admit what you did? Look, you are all these Christians in the first place. Where's your contrition? I mean, where is it? I mean, where is it that you admit what you did? And Joe Biden, don't give me this bullshit that this is a sin. It's a crime. It's an international war crime, what you did. And you know what? It continued after it was established as a war crime. I mean, genocide was established in the 1940s. You would continue this behavior for another 30 years or so on the U.S. side and another 50 years on the American or Canadian side. So you didn't get grandfathered in the right to commit genocide without reprisal. So we have to be clear in what we're saying took place there. We have to tell the stories. We have to tell the stories not just of the atrocities, but how much of a struggle. And look, I get it. It's painful. I get it. I mean, getting people to recount their experiences in these schools, I mean, it's like reliving the trauma all over again. But you can't apologize if you won't even admit how many children died. There's been no full assessment on the number of children who died in these schools. I mean, some of the territories on the Canadian side started hiring their own contractors to come in with ground penetrating radar to get a sense for how many children were buried in unmarked or mass graves. And even that, many people in Canada want to refute that. Well, it's not like they dug them up and repatriated the bones. No, some did. But even in the absence, I mean, let's be clear, even in the absence of a single death, there are 4 other overt acts that constitute genocide that these schools represented. And clearly there was death because there were graveyards. I mean, there were marked graves with tombstones or crosses or, whatever, Christian symbolism they wanted to put over the death of a child. Once and here's the thing, once they baptized that child, it didn't matter if they died. As far as they were concerned, regardless of how those kids were tortured or mutilated or abused, you saved their soul because you baptized them. That's the belief that is the belief that was held. Pope Francis named Junipero a saint. Children died at the hands of Junipero out in what is known now as California at an alarmingly high rate. But it didn't matter because, again, he wrote this in his journals. The important thing is that their souls were saved, that those children were saved. Even though they died at 4 or 5, 6 years old, I saved them because I baptized them. I mean, maybe in your twisted version of Christianity, that's considered saving somebody. But that's not what we consider it. Look, Indigenous Peoples Day, October 13th, is coming up. And there's not a whole lot of activities being generated for that. And, I haven't been asked to speak anywhere. I was going to come to New York on the 13th and go over to Randall's Island. But that thing ends at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. My train doesn't even get into 1. So I scratched it off the list. I will say, I'm doing a special broadcast on WPFW on October 13th, Indigenous Peoples Day, from 1 to 3 p.m. So if you're available and you're looking for something to do for a couple of hours, don't be afraid to tune me in on WPFW in Washington, D.C. On Indigenous Peoples Day. They're starting their fund drive, and so we'll do some pitching. But I've got some messages. I've got some things to say. Now, the following day, I'm heading out to Hofstra University, and we're going to screen Sugarcane. Yeah, I know I have my own movie, but Sugarcane is still, it's this story. It's just one of hundreds and hundreds of stories of what took place at residential schools. But Sugarcane we're screening it at Hofstra on the 14th, I think at 6 p.m. And I'm going to do a Q&A, and my good friend Mario Murillo is going to be there. He's going to be a part of the discussion. So we have things coming up. And of course, I am working on doing some screenings for our film, The Long Hope. We are doing a screening. In fact, this Sunday, I'm heading up to Akwesasne. We're doing a screening. On October 17th, we are doing a screening here in the village outside of the Cattaraugus territory, the Seneca Nation village called Gowanda. We're doing a screening at their Hollywood Theater. And then we are also doing a screening at the Brooklyn Children's Museum on November 6th. And then we're going to run out to California because our film has been accepted into the Red Nation International Film Festival, and they are going to be screening it in California, in Los Angeles, I should say, on November 15th. So I'm working on many other dates in New York and Washington and various places, native territories. Working on doing one out in Mashantucket Pequot, in Shinnecock territory. So we're working on all of these events to show the film and to have this conversation, because that's what the film is about. The film is about this conversation. But I'm going to tell you, we have got to decide as Native people, are we merely the descendants of a once proud, free, and independent people? Or are we still those people? And if we aren't, why not? I mean, are we submitting to government policy to such an extent that we no longer consider ourselves autonomous? I mean, I know the federal government claims to have full, unfettered, unencumbered authority over our lives. But that doesn't mean we have to accept it. In fact, we have to push back. We've got to push back on the doctrine of Christian discovery. That's what my film is about. We got to push back on the trust doctrine because we aren't wards of the federal government. And the federal government is not our trustee. And there are judges who know it. I talked about it on my last show. We got 2 conservative justices who question the whole plenary powers doctrine. Well, what about the other 3, the 3 liberals? What about Jackson and Sotomayor and Kagan? I mean, we know what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did over 20 years ago when she essentially ruled using the doctrine of Christian discovery, not only citing it in her footnotes, but her whole ruling was based on this notion that our lands were taken from us and that it was okay. And it was because white Christian Europeans discovered our lands. She would later recant some of that in her book, which is almost more of a slap in the face, because you sold books with more thought on this issue than when you ruled on it and made money off of the pain and suffering you caused. So now I ask the liberal justices on the court, when are you going to at least hear what Sam Alito has said? Or hear what Clarence Thomas has said? Look, I know you don't agree with these guys ideologically, but on this one you should. But we got to decide who we are as Native people. And look, and I get it. Some people think that is just too far a reach to suggest that we could ever truly be free people again, independent people. I'm not in that camp. I say we can. And, it's funny, they again, truth and reconciliation. I looked up reconciliation. You know what the definition of reconciliation is? To restore friendly relations. That was definition number 1. Of course, reconciliation can also be involved with reconciling your checkbook or that kind of stuff. But the definition of reconciliation was to restore friendly relations. When did we have friendly relations? How do you restore something that never existed? But I'll tell you, I'm all about restoration. Restore our lands. I'm not suggesting we're going to get all our lands back. But even the lands that we occupy, the federal governments on both the U.S. and Canadian side claim that they're holding it. They're holding the title for us, for our use and enjoyment. They hold it in trust. Well, there is no trust. So hand over the documents. Write it off that it's our land. You did originally. Originally, you made it clear that you acknowledged that these lands were ours. Then you adopted this doctrine of Christian discovery BS and then claimed otherwise. Even though you entered into treaties where you literally used that language. The property is yours and we will never claim the same. Canandaigua Treaty, 1794. 20 years later, an activist judge, Chief Justice John Marshall, says, oh, no, they don't really hold title. They only have the right of occupancy, which we can eliminate. We acknowledge that we possess the titles to their land because we're the Christian nations of Europe, subject only to the right of occupancy. But when you parse that out, you realize that when they referred to right of occupancy, they didn't mean it like a human right, like we as human beings had a right to occupy lands. They were viewing us more along the lines like the flora and the fauna, like a wolf or a deer or a rabbit, or a spread of aspen trees. That we had this natural right as an animal or as vegetation to occupy land, but they could still wipe out the wolves. They could wipe out the eagles. They could wipe out the forest. They could do all that stuff. And they ruled in the 1950s that they could extinguish our right to occupancy and any claim that we might have to the resources of a land that we occupied. In fact, it was the same court that ruled this, and this was called the Teton case. It was the same court that ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. They could address racism when it came to black kids in school, but they couldn't recognize the racist ideology that they employed in the Teton case to say that they could extinguish our right to occupancy. So, no, it wasn't a human right. It was just this general sense that, yeah, you were here and, so you have a right to be here until we take it away from you. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And how is it that the 3 liberal justices of the Supreme Court can't see any of this? And yet Alito and Thomas can? I mean, give me a freaking break. That's about as absurd as anything you could suggest to me about the U.S. judicial system. And here's the crazy part. We sat in a room with all of the federal agencies up on a stage at the National Museum, American Museum, or whatever they call it, the NMAI, the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., Smithsonian Museum. We sat in there, and they kept saying the concern that the United States had with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that it was somehow going to change international law. Well, there was nothing special in that declaration. They'd already done the Declaration on Human Rights, but somehow, because there was some question about our humanness, I guess, they had to do another one that included us. But there was nothing really special in that. But what the United States was worried was the current remedy that they felt existed for resolving conflicts with Native people was going to be usurped by this. And they kept saying that. And so I personally asked the moderator, and I don't remember even who was speaking, but I said, what is this remedy you keep talking about? And they said, well, our court system. Your court system created these illegal legal doctrines that can only be assessed as authoritarian rule. They aren't constitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that could cast us as wards of the federal government. We weren't even citizens. We weren't even counted as a part of your population. And yet somehow you were able to delegate or relegate us as wards of the federal government, and then assume yourself or appoint yourself as our trustees, and then appoint Congress to have ultimate authority over every aspect of our lives with the power to regulate the metes and bounds of our sovereignty. And I don't even like to use the word sovereignty, because our free and independent existence wasn't about power. It wasn't about authority over lands and authority over peoples. It was about freedom. Our long hope is to restore our autonomy, to restore our distinction. But the only way we can do that is to eliminate these so-called legal doctrines. We've got to erase it from their law. And yeah, it's going to be really disruptive when we do it. And that's probably why those 3 liberal justices just sit there on their hands and don't do a damn thing. They just go along with it. They treat the plenary powers doctrine as settled law. They say it over and over and over again. Well, it's settled law. The court has firmly established that this is what it is. Like I said, in the last couple of shows, last month, a case was filed in California, up in San Francisco. It was an appeals court, and they cited the doctrine of Christian discovery a month ago. not 20 years ago, not 50 years ago, not 100 years ago or 200 years ago, a month ago. And they went through, and this is the crazy part, they went through acknowledging what the reservation system was about, confining us onto these little tiny spots. They talked about how allotment was designed to take our lands away and to force assimilation. They don't even talk about the residential schools. And this ruling, the ruling that they had in this case where they cited this, and this is called Halverson versus Burgum. Burgum was the Interior Secretary. This ruling was to affirm, I guess, or to keep in place a previous ruling that the United States could not be sued because of sovereign immunity. Well, then answer me this. How the hell are the courts a remedy for us if we can't ever bring the case into court because you're going to throw it out because you're going to claim to be sovereign, have sovereign immunity? That is what you do. So none of this stuff is real. It's all fantasy, it's all fallacy, and it's all lie. So our people have to stop accepting it. The doctrine of Christian discovery is a lie. The trust doctrine is a lie. There is no trust, not as a virtue or as some sort of legally established relationship. There's no trust relationship. There's no trust responsibility. We have to stop saying that. There's debt, there's obligation, and there's probably a whole lot of damages that need to be paid. You know, the other definition of reconciliation, as I mentioned, you could reconcile a ledger or reconcile your checkbook. Well, let's do it. Let's reconcile your ledger. What did when Haaland was issued her report on residential schools as the screen door was hitting her in the ass as she was going out the door, she said that they did an assessment, not of the damages or the harm or the profitability that they saw by doing this to our people, by committing this genocide. No, they didn't assess that. What they assessed was, well, how much did we pay to do it? How much did it cost us to commit not 150, but only 150 years of genocide? So that's what they did. They did an assessment on how much it cost them in the last 100 years of funding residential schools and all of the other associated costs. $23.3 billion was an adjusted number, adjusted for inflation. That's how much the United States spent in the commission of this crime. Then Haaland suggested, and again, first ever Native person to ever serve as a cabinet secretary, head of the Interior Department, a Native woman, decided that the mere cost of committing the crime should have been the equivalent value of making this right, of redress. Not ever assessing what the actual damages were, but if we have a starting place at what you paid out to commit this crime, $23.3 billion, I don't know where it ends up, but let me tell you this. A little white boy who gets molested by a priest as an altar boy grows up to be a man and gets a $10 million settlement from the Catholic Church. One child. So what are you going to do about our children? Not just the ones that were raped, the ones that were murdered, the ones that died, the ones who had all this historical trauma. Do you think $23.3 billion is going to cover it? I don't think so. And that's just settling up on the damages. I'm not asking you to give us land. We'll get our land. I'm asking you to get out of the way when we take our land back or buy our land back or acquire it, however means we acquire it. Don't give me your Ruth Bader Ginsburg doctrine of impossibility or doctrine of discovery argument to say, no, the Oneidas couldn't reacquire lost land because their embers of sovereignty had long grown cold. Don't even try that. Don't even try that again. It was wrong then. She knew it. She wrote it in her book. She knew it was wrong. She probably knew it was wrong at the time. She's a Jewish lady. Citing the doctrine of Christian discovery as a means to exterminate or to extinguish a land acquisition attempt by the Oneidas? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So, no, we'll get our land back. And again, the first thing we start with is eliminating this idea that land is held in trust. No, we want the titles. And we're going to craft our own titles for the land. We're going to craft our own travel documents too. And we don't want you in our way. We're going to reassert our autonomy, our distinction. We are moving towards recapturing a free and independent existence. The question is, how much do we have to fight you to do it? I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not asking you to grant us freedom. You have no more power to grant us freedom than you did to impose your citizenship on us. That was another fallacy, part of your so-called plenary powers. We don't acknowledge it. And increasingly, my life's work I will spend the rest of my days convincing Native people to reject this notion. Our people praised the plenary powers when it was used to defend the Indian Child Welfare Act, a crappy law that still doesn't place us with or recognize our authority over our own children. But our people clapped when the Brackeens failed to challenge the constitutionality, and they didn't lose. They didn't lose on whether the Indian Child Welfare Act was constitutional or not. No. Instead, the court said, well, we don't have to evaluate the constitutionality of a law by Congress about Native people. This court, these courts, our courts have accepted it as settled law that Congress can do whatever it wants. In fact, Sam Alito asked the question. Well, if plenary powers means plenary, it seems like Congress can do whatever it wants. He even asked the Solicitor General in oral arguments, so does the plenary powers of Congress mean that they could actually send kids to residential schools? Could they start up residential schools all over again? Could they do that whole episode again? And Needler, the guy's name was Needler, I don't know his first name, he said yes, they could. And when he was pressed, so what is the limitation of this authority? And he said, well, they have to fulfill their trust obligation. The trust obligation was made up from the plenary powers. I mean, it's circular reasoning. So we had two conservative justices because Clarence Thomas questioned plenary powers too. Over I don't know 30 years ago, I think over 20 years ago. Yeah, it was over 20 years ago. He questioned it about whether it was constitutional, whether there was any constitutional basis. And he flat out said, I see no basis in the Constitution for this notion of plenary powers. That's what Clarence Thomas said over 20 years ago. So when he and Alito voted against this ruling on the Indian Child Welfare Act, they voted against it solely on this basis of plenary powers doctrine. Not whether the Brackeens should have been able to adopt a Native kid or not, this rich white family. They never even got a chance to have that discussion. They couldn't discuss the racism. They couldn't discuss the equal application of the law under the 14th Amendment. They couldn't discuss the constitutionality of this federal overreach into state powers. No, it never even got there. It was cut off right at the plenary powers doctrine. And they said, look, we can't rule with the majority on this thing because we don't see it. Well, what about the three liberal justices? Kagan, Sotomayor, Jackson. Look, you three are what represents the diversity on the court. Kagan, you're a Jewish lady. You should understand some of this. You should understand something about the American Holocaust. Sotomayor, look, not only are you Catholic and should know something about contrition, you should know this. And Jackson, I assume you're probably a Christian too. But as a black woman, how do you not acknowledge the racism associated with these legal doctrines? See, this is the question. And this is, again, I'm going to spend my remaining days educating my own people about how we have to reject this, but I'm also going to be pounding on whatever liberal justices exist on that court to say, look, how do you ignore when Sam Alito is questioning the plenary powers doctrine? Or when Clarence Thomas is? I realized none of those three were even on the court when he was questioning it, but he's questioning it still. And frankly, I think Thomas and Alito could drag Neil Gorsuch along with him. He tries to rule favorably towards Native people, but he always does it within the same context. Well, Congress has that power, though. The McGirt decision, the first thing that he says in his ruling is, well, they never extinguished their lands. So the land's still, it's still native lands. He begins his whole argument, his ruling, with this idea, well, if Congress had extinguished that land title, then it would be extinguished. Because, again, these guys think that Congress has all this power to do this stuff. So here's where we are. So we're going to head into Indigenous Peoples Day in a little over a week. Come November, we're going to talk about Native American Heritage Month, or not. We may not talk about it. I'll talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it as far as Native American Heritage Month, but I'm going to point out the hypocrisy of it. I'm going to point out the ludicrous nature of designating these days or these months with this PR mumbo jumbo and still doing nothing. We can talk about the genocide in Gaza, and there is genocide in Gaza. But if you're going to ignore the genocide here while you're talking about it over there, if you're going to talk about what immigrants are experiencing here and ignore what we've experienced and still experience, and not to mention we get mistaken for immigrants in the first place, because, we kind of got the same color skin. Yeah, let's talk about Bad Bunny. Let's talk about all this stuff. But you know what? We can't even have a conversation, a truthful conversation, about what you did with 150 years of residential schools. You won't even have that conversation. And you want to talk about truth? You want to talk about reconciliation? And I said it before, shame on you, Deb Haaland. You waited until you were almost out the door to put your signature on a report on residential schools and did nothing, made 9 recommendations, and then you knew you weren't going to be around to make sure any of it happened. Oh, yeah, you got Joe Biden to go down there and make an apology to try to get votes for Kamala Harris, a political stunt at that. I don't want an apology. I'm not going to accept your apology because I don't forgive you. I'll tell you why I don't forgive you for a couple of reasons. One, you haven't even admitted what you did. Part of my culture. We have no word in Mohawk or Seneca for forgiveness. How could I? How could I forgive? How could I let it go? Now, we have words in our language that talk about getting past an issue. But just because I went past it doesn't mean I can't turn around and see it. I know the history. I know what you did. And I know in the world that we live in today, it's entirely possible for this stuff to happen again. And you know what Sam Alito asked? He asked the Solicitor General of the United States, does plenary powers mean that Congress could rip kids away from their home and send them to boarding schools again? And the Solicitor General said, yes, it does. They have that power because there's no limitation to it. There's no checks and balances. Well, that wraps this one up, folks. I hope I left you with something. Do I seem a little angry? Yeah, I probably always seem a little angry. Not completely angry, though. So we'll be back. I am John Kane. This is Resistance Radio. We'll see you next time. Yahweh.